Finally, I just am so thrilled to introduce Catherine Lhamon, our opening keynote speaker. I had the privilege of hearing her about 2 years ago speaking at another conference. Her bio is on page 7. It's very impressive. But there is one date that to me is extremely significant. December 15th, 2016, she was nominated as chair of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. And note that date, December 15th, 2016. Just think about that date. And it is for a 6-year term. And she was unanimously approved by the other commissioners. And so we will have her, Lord willing, in this role for the next 4 years, going past, it's purposely designed, so it's not limited to one administration. So, yes, think about that. The beauty of the Civil Rights Commission is that it is designed to be bipartisan with members of both parties and independents, because civil rights should never, ever be a partisan issue. It's one thing to have equal justice under the law, which we know does not always happen. That is one of the things they address. It's another thing to make sure we have laws that are just, and that's another thing that they address. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Catherine Lhamon to come, and she will address us, and then there will be a time for question and answer afterwards. So please give a warm Healthcare for the Homeless welcome to Catherine Lhamon.
Thank you all, and Bobby, thank you for that lovely introduction and for your leadership of this amazing council. I need to tell you what an uplift it is for me to see the 1,000 of you come together today to work toward justice. It's an amazing, amazing commitment that you make now and that you make every day to that goal. And I'm so grateful to know that you're out there around the country doing the work that you do. So many, many thanks as we start. We in this room know how incredibly urgent the work that you do is every day to ensure that some of the most vulnerable among us have access to housing and to services that they need to subsist and to survive. And the data I see in California alone is astonishing about increases in rates of homelessness. So I know in my home state, I know around the country, the deep, deep urgency for the work that you do. I also know that in these bleak times, when we document rises in hate incidents, which we know all too often is visited on homeless people because of their particular vulnerability, and pervasive discrimination, and increasing government rejection of a social safety net, that those factors impress on all of us a need to do what you all have promised, to work together toward justice. So thank you for that promise. I come to you today, thank you for the applause too for that promise. I come to you today to speak about the civil rights connection to the work that you do and the essential role you play in safeguarding our country's best promises to itself. The commission I chair, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, is, as Bobby mentioned, a bipartisan commission congressionally charged now for 61 years to advise the President, Congress, and the American people about the state of civil rights. I will tell you that the state of those rights is not good right now. We have, of course, never in this country reached the mountaintop where we no longer need to be vigilant about safeguarding those rights and safeguarding against civil rights harm. This country has, as we know, always struggled to satisfy its ideals, lurching in fits and starts toward nonlinear but often steady progress forward. These times now are especially challenging, when we don't even hear verbal commitment to equity principles and ideals, and instead hear federal denigration of some among us as people and witness policy after policy rolling back civil rights protection that we have until now been able to take for granted. My bipartisan commission colleagues and I have time and again in the 2.5 years that I have chaired the commission voted, sometimes unanimously, sometimes by majority, for the federal government, to urge the federal government to do more to protect civil rights, including through denouncing hate incidents and bias promotion, rejecting administration proposals to desecrate federal civil rights enforcement, among other topics. I will preview my conclusion to this talk by telling you I'm going to call on you to join me in doing what you are doing and more than you are doing now to protect and to be the safety net that our country needs. But before we get there, it will, I imagine, not surprise you to know that homelessness, the issue of homelessness, pervades all of the equity issues that my commission investigates. The issue of people experiencing homelessness or unstable access to stable housing cuts across all of the issues that we investigate at the commission, starting to what is most current. The commission is in the middle of a 2-year investigation of federal civil rights enforcement across all of the federal civil rights agencies, including, as most relevant to our topic today, the Housing and Urban Development Agency. Without getting ahead of what my commission colleagues and I will ultimately vote on to make recommendations through this investigation, I will share with you today some of my own views of what we have seen so far in this investigation. Certainly, HUD Secretary Ben Carson has given civil rights proponents plenty of fodder for criticism, including when he has stated his preference for spare and crowded shelters so people accessing them won't, as he said, get too comfortable and decide that they don't need to try to secure housing on their own. Again, as recently as this week, he testified to Congress on Tuesday that HUD plans to eject families with citizen children from public housing, not, he says, because HUD is heartless, but instead, he says, because HUD is logical. He does not dispute HUD's own data reflecting tens of thousands of citizens who will be rendered homeless by HUD's decision, but instead characterizes that decision as a logical choice to reserve that housing for families who are fully composed of American citizens. I say this to you wholly without emotion and reasoning, only from logic. This prioritization of whom among us is worthy of help, as distinct from seeking practices that leave no American unsheltered, is anathema to an equity principle. But wait, there's more. Secretary Carson also testified on Tuesday to have no plans to change HUD's equal access rule for shelters, and then on Wednesday, yesterday, posted in the Federal Register a proposed revision to that rule to leave transgender persons without access to shelter protection. That is exactly my reaction. Study after study, including information that the Commission shared in a report last year about LGBT employment discrimination, reflects that transgender Americans are particularly vulnerable to homelessness. But notwithstanding that vulnerability, HUD proposes now to bless decisions to segregate based on sex without respecting gender identity. Secretary Carson has, in the past, explained that this issue is, he says, complicated, because women may be afraid to have men together with them in shelters. Transgender women are women. And the rule that HUD now proposes to change had, before its rollback, clarified straightforward ways to protect safety for all shelter residents, which should be the paramount concern. I know I am speaking to the choir on this, but I will share that in my litigation life, representing general relief recipients, among others, I have heard testimony after testimony from people who share their experience of assault and possession theft when they access temporary shelter, as well as when they live without shelter. Safety concern is visceral and real, and I welcome federal guidance about how providers can protect rights. I do not welcome reliance on retrograde assumptions about what defines a woman to decline protection to some among us. And that is what we see now from HUD. A charge to protect housing means a charge to protect fairness for all of us. We should be able to expect that from our federal government, but today we cannot. During the course of our investigation, the Commission has learned that the Trump administration repeatedly seeks to lower fair housing enforcement funding, rendering a long-standingly hamstrung federal agency less able to fulfill its mission to secure fair housing. We've learned that the Fair Housing Agency effectively no longer uses its strongest tool, which was Secretary-initiated investigations. Those investigations signal executive commitment to the particular fair housing issue being investigated, but this administration has used them only one time in the 2.5 years of the administration so far. These, among other concerns, emphasize the vital importance right now that you all continue and excel at the work you do, because the clearest, the strongest message that we receive now from the federal government is that it is not now serious about enforcing civil rights protections and is not a reliable backstop against harm. That message is unfortunately not limited to one area of concern. Turning to other areas that the Commission has recently investigated, in a report that we issued last fall, we documented ongoing, current, widespread barriers to the right to vote, which is, of course, the bedrock of American democracy. On every measure that we investigated, litigation success, data regarding discrimination incidents, investigations from 12 state advisory committees around the country, testimony from 23 bipartisan voting rights experts and advocates, and in-person and written public comment, the information the Commission received underscores that discrimination persists now with respect to voting. The investigation lowlighted many issues that affect people experiencing homelessness or who are without stable housing, including voter ID requirements and exclusively voting by mail. Just to give you a few examples, our New Hampshire State Advisory Committee heard testimony that the New Hampshire voter ID law presents barriers for people experiencing homelessness to being able to vote in New Hampshire. I thank you to the providers here who provide critical services to people experiencing homelessness to ensure that those individuals can get an ID and can participate in democracy. Also, some states like Oregon and Washington State have moved exclusively to voting by mail. And this conversion, of course, introduces basic accessibility problems for people who don't have homes, because without an address, those voters will never receive a ballot. We reported on concerns specifically from Native American communities in Oregon who shared that it was, quote, virtually impossible for Native American voters without homes to vote. We also, as a commission, recently investigated the civil rights implications of police use of force. And one key concern that the commission investigated and the commission majority emphasized was the Attorney General's decision to reconsider federal investigations related to constitutional policing. I came to federal government from Los Angeles, where I had been a civil rights litigator for close to 2 decades before coming. And in my time in Los Angeles, I represented community interveners in the federal government's consent decree to reform the Los Angeles Police Department. I know from that work the 40 preceding years of unabated police preying on the community that they swore to protect and serve, and that prey included death and other harm to homeless members of my Los Angeles community. I, among other lawyers, sued the LAPD to try to reform the police department. But what it took, thank you for that, but what it took to bring about the reform that we now see, which is not complete, but materially changed, what it took was actual federal oversight, which persisted under the watchful eye of a vigilant federal judge for years, to emphasize how serious we all were about the change that our community desperately needed. As the commission majority found, all community members should be able to live, work, and travel confident in an expectation that interactions with police officers will be fair, operate consistent with constitutional norms, and be guided by public safety free from bias or discrimination. But what we know is that too many among us don't live that expectation. And what we know from research-based evidentiary support evaluating the effectiveness of federal review of these police departments is that when the federal government is involved, when it is an actual backstop against that constitutional harm, we see material change among the police community relationships in those communities. So for this department to have turned away from that core tool, to say that it will not engage in what is a 23-year congressional mandate that only the Department of Justice has to be able to investigate those constitutional policing practices, we are all rendered less safe as a country. So the common theme that runs through these investigations that the Commission is conducting is that civil rights don't protect themselves, and we as communities must take action to protect our civil rights protections for all of us. That distressing truism is far from new. Thomas Jefferson is famous for having said that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. But we live a moment now when our federal leadership, instead of espousing aspirational ideals and leading a path toward them, actively eschews those ideals and its government role in reaching them. That places us at a scary precipice now, with the federal government affirmatively refusing to enforce the laws Congress has written and finding ways to undervalue core rights for Americans, bringing us in this room to a stark choice about who we will be in this moment. We have a palpable and important, near constant reminder now that reliance on federal solution to equity harm is not realistic. In truth, that point is always true, and it's never wise to rely on distant federal government to safeguard all of us from harm. The federal government will never have enough resources to be in every community, in every place where it is needed at every time. So it's wise, always, even in the best of times, which we clearly are not in now, for us to know that we should be our own safety net, that we should be vigilant in our own communities, holding up the values that are core to us as a democracy. So especially now, but in all times, we in this room need to step into that void. We need to not let discouragement translate into inaction, because too much is at stake. All of us in all of our communities stand vulnerable to harm if we don't throw ourselves into that breach. And I'm going to share now what is the road I believe we must follow. And that is take every single path available to you. And I say that without hyperbole. I mean it. Throw yourself into the breach, yourself, your brand, your community, your commitments. Do not prioritize one set of issues over another. Find a way to stick your finger in the dike and stop harm, because each of us has capacity to change our world. Each of us has capacity to make a difference in our communities, and our communities deserve our best in that work. I want to concretize what I mean when I say take every path, and I will say I am doing it myself. I'm not giving up on the federal government, even in this administration that expresses hostility to civil rights with its every opportunity. I accepted President Obama's invitation to chair the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights because I believed in December 2016, and I believe today, that strong voices could curb some of the harm this new administration might wreak, and I continue to believe in making a record of what should be, calling out what should not be, and in taking the mitigating wins where we can find them. Yes. That is often a lonely path, so it's really nice to be with all of you and to feel less alone, and I'm going to carry this moment with me through every day moving forward in the coming years. And I want you all to know that it's not only aspirational. We do find those mitigating wins. It is worth doing the work now. Just to give you one example, the Commission has repeatedly called on Congress to ignore this administration's request to cut back funding for civil rights agencies and encouraged Congress, in its wisdom, to support federal civil rights enforcement, actively increasing the funds. And Congress has, with both budgets in this administration, that it has had the opportunity to do so, taken that charge and has continued to support and increase support for many of our federal civil rights agencies, which I am very, very grateful for, and I think it's incredibly significant still to be able to make that call and see it heeded. As important as holding federal ground is, it's also past time for recognition that every one of us in all of our communities should be a social justice advocate, whether it's communicating with policymakers, litigating in court, providing health care to those in critical need, or managing a clinic or a hospital, among a host of other options for ways to intervene. We need to strengthen our civil rights protections and our lived experience in our local communities. So in addition to my time chairing the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, I also am Legal Affairs Secretary to California's governor, and in a very hyper-local way, I'm doing what I can to protect civil rights in the state of California, and I hope that that will continue to lead for the rest of the country. I see we have some Californians in the room. Great to see you. We should not forget, none of us should forget, the power and the reach and the benefit of building equitable local communities that lead the respect for personhood that each of us deserves. Making gains in those spaces will not only protect the residents who live in them, but will also create proof points for the possible that other cities and communities could follow. At the Commission, we hear about the value of these gains in the states, often through our state advisory committees. And I'm just going to cite one example from our Minnesota State Advisory Committee, which conducted their own investigation of police practices. And they found that people experiencing homelessness are arrested for low-level offenses at disproportionately high rates. I'm sure that is not surprising to those in this room. And in particular, that those arrests are often for offenses that are inextricably related to not having a home. The Minnesota Committee, in their report, lifted up the importance of community partnerships to address the need for effective community housing and community policing. And they highlighted, for instance, that in Minneapolis, the Downtown Improvement District partners with community organizations to conduct outreach to people experiencing homelessness. And they've hired peer outreach workers who themselves have experienced homelessness and therefore have expertise in supporting the population. Those are the kinds of ways that we can be working in our communities to improve our communities and to address harms that we see up close. That's one among countless options for ways that we in this room can disrupt harm. Each of us have capacity radically to change the circumstances of our communities, sometimes in ways we can't even hope to quantify. I read an article yesterday about a black psychiatrist in the early 1970s who worried that media representations did not often enough reflect the diversity of America, sending a damaging message to young viewers growing up without seeing themselves on TV. That doctor teamed up with the creators of what would become Sesame Street to highlight a diverse cast and equity themes along with their numeracy and literacy lessons. His insight changed self-conception as well as life understanding for generations of people who grew up benefiting from what he made. I confess to having been raised on Sesame Street. And the question, which of these things is not like the others, which I learned on Sesame Street, still resonates for me. We could all sing together, but maybe not now. So I doubt that doctor thought that he would be raising civil rights lawyers and generations of social activists when he was working on what would become Sesame Street. But his idea did, and you can, and I hope you will. From my perch at the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, I cannot impress on you strongly enough the urgency for each of us to bring our best selves to what you do every day, which is the work of social justice. We today stand at the precipice I mentioned between whom we promised we would be at our nation's founding and to whom we formally recommitted ourselves through laws over the past 6 decades, and the dreck we could become if we turn away from equity's promise. I am so very grateful to you all for banding together to bend the arc toward justice with more speed and more commitment today, and I look forward to what you will do. And I'll stop there.